The very last death sentence to be given in Poland for an economic crime was when Stanisław Wawrzecki was hanged in Warsaw on the 19th of March 1965. The death penalty was not abolished in Poland until after the fall of communism. Other communist countries also executed people for economic crimes. There were hundreds executed in the Soviet Union even after 1965, and as late as 1985, Berta Naumovna Borodkina was executed in Moscow for embezzlement and trading in goods which were in short supply. Stanisław Wawrzecki was born here in Mława on the 25th of October 1921. Mława is located northwest of Warsaw. When Wawrzecki was born, it was very close to the German border. In fact, it saw major frontier battles at the beginning of both world wars. Wawrzecki was the director of the municipal meat company in Warsaw at the beginning of the 1960s. Here I need to explain a little about how the communist system worked in a sentence or two. In theory, there was a plan. Each person produced according to his or her own ability, and then the results were shared out amongst everyone according to individual needs. There are of course some problems with this idea, most notably who gets to decide how much one person can produce and in turn how much one person needs. Everyone of course needs to eat, thus those producing food and those in the food distribution network found themselves in an advantageous position. One thing the Soviet Union discovered at the very beginning was that people producing food would only sell it at market value, and they needed to do this in order to cover their own costs. This was true 40 years later and continued to be so until the fall of the system. People in cities were prepared to pay a bit extra to get extra food, or maybe not so much a bit extra, a lot extra, to get better quality food. To do this, they probably would have some kind of a side job working in what was effectively the free market. There were those, therefore, who used the system to their own gain. However, there were those who were already in an advantageous position. They were members of the Communist Party and their protegees. They were able to get better or well-paid jobs in state-controlled enterprises, irrespective of whether they knew how to do the job or not. They were there for their political reliability or because they knew how to grease the palms of those further up the food chain. This is how the communist system worked. It was based on corruption, friendships, and the use of force against those who were not part of the establishment elite. Communism is probably the most extreme form of a modern class-based society. Whereas in capitalism it's possible for a poor person to work her or his way up through the system by hard work, in communism it was based around personal contacts and belonging to the elite. I suspect that Stanisław Wawrzecki was within this elite, otherwise he would not have got the job that he had. I doubt that he was employed due to his skill at handling the meat distribution business. Of course, I could be wrong. I could be saying something nasty about him. Maybe he was absolutely brilliant at his job. But if he was, then he would have been the exception. Due to the shortage of meat, there was more demand than supply. In a capitalist society, this would lead to higher meat prices. In a communist society, this also leads to higher prices for the consumer, but not for the producer, as those in the distribution network took their cut, and that cut was normally a very large cut. Those working in the state-owned shops would keep the best cuts of meat for their private clients, selling them far above the going rate, whilst those without contact got the rest, or indeed nothing. This was the case with absolutely everything. Now, to give an example, I can recall in the 1980s that it was impossible to buy a Polish-English dictionary in a normal shop, but they were freely available on the markets, but at a price several times more than the published price. Demand was higher than supply. The people in the shops would buy everything in order to sell them at a profit on the markets. On the other hand, buying a Russian Portuguese dictionary, for example, for which there was little demand, was no problem. Stanisław Wawrzecki was fortunate enough to be allowed to travel abroad on official business, a privilege granted to very few in the establishment elite. On the 18th of April 1964 he was returning from Bucharest, where he'd been on a business delegation. He was arrested at the airport. He was put on trial, and during the trial the whole web of corruption came out. He admitted to accepting bribes from butcher shop managers, which came to 3.5 million zloty at the time. This was an astronomical sum, equivalent to something like 150 years' earnings for an average worker. The penalty demanded by law for this was 5 years imprisonment, and of course the guilty party would lose their well-placed job, but for that type of money it's certainly worth losing a well-placed job. The trial was conducted summarily, which was unconstitutional at the time. One would have to ask why a summary trial was held 10 months after the arrest. Doesn't make any sense. However, a summary trial meant no possibility of appeal to another court. The prosecutor asked for the death sentence. The presiding judge, Roman Krzyża, sentenced Stanisław Wawrzecki to death. The verdict was announced on the 2nd of February 1965. The only route for the defendant was a clemency appeal. The appeal was rejected. The sentence was carried out on the 19th of March 1965 by hanging in the Mokotów prison at ulica Rakowiecka 37 in Warsaw. This verdict was overturned by the Supreme Court on the 27th of July 2004. The Supreme Court discontinued the proceedings because the statute of limitations had expired. A few years later, the investigative department of the IPN, the Institute of National Remembrance, accused the prosecutor in the meat scandal trial of exceeding his powers and failing to fulfill his duties, which is punishable by up to 3 years in prison. However, as he was long dead, there was nothing further to do. As a result of the Supreme Court decision, one of the sons of Stanisław Wawrzecki, Andrzej Wawrzecki, sued the state for 500,000 zloty. There had been a currency reform in 1995 where 10,000 old zloty was equal to 1 new zloty. Wawrzecki was awarded 200,000 zloty in compensation. In this hearing, the court found that the judges and prosecutor in 1965 abused their powers and emphasised that if it were not for the unjustified summary procedure, Wawrzecki would not have been sentenced to death. The court found that the trial was aimed at a specific propaganda purpose and was prepared in various circles. And now I'm quoting what the court said. Whereas there's no question that Wawrzecki committed the offence he was found guilty of, there are opinions that this was a judicial murder and that the verdict was issued at the highest levels of power. The head of the Polish United Workers' Party, Władysław Gomułka, was said to have insisted on it. The judge, Roman Joseph Krzyża, was born here in Lviv, Ukraine on the 4th of July 1907. When he was born it was called Lemberg and it was in Austria. It was to become later Lwów in Poland before it was occupied by the Soviet Union in September 1939 when the Nazis and Communists joined forces to invade Poland. Krzyża served as a judge here in Grudziądz at the district court. He was a reserve officer of the 63rd Torun Infantry Regiment during the 1930s. During the September campaign of 1939, he served as a second lieutenant in the 65th Infantry Regiment. On the 18th of September 1939, he was taken prisoner and imprisoned here at Offlag 7C Laufen POW camp number 32085. According to his Red Cross file, he was transferred out on the 29th of May 1940, probably to Offlag 7B in Eichstätt. In May 1945 he was back here in Grudziądz. From the 14th of May 1945 he was a judge at the municipal court in Grudziądz, where he stayed for 2 months before being transferred to the Supreme Military Court. Whilst here he was involved in the prosecution of the anti-communist and the former anti-Nazi resistance. His victims included such names as Major Tadeusz Pleśniak and Captain Witold Pilecki, best known as the officer who voluntarily allowed himself to be deported to Auschwitz, from where he later escaped. After liberation from communism, many of Krzyż's sentences were recognized as judicial murders, the same as those of Roland Freisler in Nazi Germany or Andrzej Wyszynski in the Soviet Union. There's a saying in Polish, sądzi Krzyża, będą Krzyża. That means Krzyża is his name, sądzić is to judge, sądzi means he, she, it judges, and here is the funny bit, Krzyża sounds like his name, that means crosses. So, what this tongue twister says is this, Krzyża judges, there will be crosses. The crosses, of course, refer to the crosses above the graves. So, they're referring to the death sentences that this Stalinist judge gave to those who were opposed to Stalinism, communism, and previously to the Nazi occupation. This judicial murderer was able to escape justice. He died in 1983, but his son, Andrzej Krzyża, also became a lawyer and continued the family tradition. Andrzej Krzyża was born into a world of privilege as a member of the communist ruling class in Poland. As a judge, he sentenced future president of Poland, Stanisław Komorowski, to prison in 1979, amongst many others. As far as Andrzej Krzyża was concerned, his communist past and the murderous past of his father was no hindrance to his political career in the so-called Law and Justice Party, PiS for short. From November 2005 to May 2006, he was Secretary of State at the Ministry of Justice, and from May 2006 to November 2007, he was Under Secretary of State at the Ministry of Justice. In 2007, Minister of Justice Zbigniew Ziobro submitted the candidacy of Andrzej Krzyża to be a judge at the Court of Appeals in Warsaw. The National Council of the Judiciary rejected this request. Later, Zbigniew Ziobro appointed Andrzej Krzyża as a prosecutor of the National Prosecutor's Office. When PiS returned to power in 2015, they attempted to subvert the way judges were chosen, and the reason was, and I kid you not, to remove judges who were communists from the legal system. Andrzej Krzyża was born in 1948 at a time when his father was judicially murdering those opposed to Nazism and Stalinism. Andrzej Krzyża is still alive, so I have to be very careful what I say about him. He's probably got some very powerful mates, although fortunately they are no longer in power. Stanisław Wawrzecki had 3 sons, one of whom became quite famous, but doing something much more respectable than the son of Krzyża. He became the compere on the television show Koło Fortuny, the Wheel of Fortune. To return to 1964, why did the Communist Party then need Stanisław Wawrzecki to hang? I think what was required was a show trial, a piece of the communist playbook used since the 1930s by Andrzej Wyszynski and copied by the Nazis under Roland Freisler. Everyone can see that communism doesn't work. It didn't work then either, and so therefore somebody had to be blamed. After all, the party and its leadership can't possibly be responsible for everything that's happening. It needs to be emphasized, strongly emphasized, that unlike almost all, if not all, of the death sentences given by these judges, Wawrzecki was guilty. I think, and this is just my suspicion, that Wawrzecki was chosen because he failed to grease enough palms around him and he didn't share out his fabulous wealth, or at least not enough. Of course, I must stress again, that's just my opinion. I don't really know. There was usually no secret in who was taking bribes. However, they did need to be relatively discreet, even in 1960s Poland. Presumably, Wawrzecki wasn't discreet enough. Thanks for listening. I hope you found that interesting. I upload every Friday at 2000 hours my time. I live in Poland and in Germany, and therefore I do videos largely on Nazi and communist history. So if you're interested in this type of thing, then this is the place to subscribe to. I also do live chats as well, and that give you the opportunity to correspond not only with me in real time, but also with other users as well. So from me, for now, thanks for listening, and bye for now.